Okay, welcome back for the second half of this lecture, chapter 11 on political violence. We left off talking about terrorism. This is the slide that I had already covered with the definitional aspects. And now we're moving on to the economic, political spheres of terrorism. One thing to keep in mind as we start off covering the aspects of terrorism from that first half is that one could take an entire 16-week course on the study of terrorism. So we certainly don't have time to cover all aspects of the field. Just remember that we're only scratching the surface here. Evidence shows that terrorist groups tend to be oriented around specific goals and that they are not simply driven by extreme religious views, an intrinsic love of violence, or personal humiliation and despair. Those have been ruled out. In fact, most terrorist groups engage in well coordinated strategies to try to coerce changes from their targets. It, if we are thinking of them as rational actors, then the causes of this violence are um, certainly possible to predict. Institutional, ideational, and individual explanations for terrorism are both useful and problematic. Some people sometimes cite poverty and a lack of education as triggers for terrorism. The reality is that terrorist leaders are often wealthier and more educated than the rest of the population of their home country. The frustrated elite seems to be a particular or a typical pattern in terrorist recruits around the world. As a result, weak economics is a poor predictor of terrorism. Um, Political explanations do a slightly better job at predicting terrorism. Terrorism is more likely in states with a weak capacity and autonomy. In addition, some scholars have argued that terrorism is more likely in hybrid or illiberal regimes, ones with weak participatory cultures. Terrorism is less common in democracies and full autocracies, non democracies. In democracies, it's argued that these are the states allow nonviolent outlets for frustrations. In fully non-democratic states, terrorism may be less common, either because the regime cracks down so really hard on those terrorists, which increases the risk of this activity, or because the regime does not report terrorism out of a fear of losing public legitimacy. There's certainly some things to kind of keep in the back of your mind when we're covering this. So, if for those students who are interested in examining terrorism a little bit further, you might want to look into Mia Bloom. She's a leading scholar at Georgia Tech. She is the lead scholar actually in the United States on female suicide bombers. And she has a TED Talk that I think is still up for free on YouTube. Um, some analysts have blamed terrorism on specific ideologies, religions, or sets of values. Terrorist groups span many religions and ideologies. So that doesn't really offer a good causal explanation. Instead, some argue that what is most important is when those ideas connect with nihilism. Nihilism can be combined with utopian views, arguing that violence is necessary to destroy or purify a corrupt world. In explaining Europe's recent outbreak of terrorism, French political scientist Oliver Breuil argues that nihilism is one of the defining features, as nearly all the perpetrators are European born, second generation immigrants with little previous religious affiliation prior to their radicalization. And you can find that article in The Guardian. The title of it is "Who Are the New Jihadis?" You may or may not agree with Waugh's argument on nihilism, but it is an interesting one. Um, we might want to question whether certain ideas really cause terrorist violence. Religious justifications, in particular, are often used by perpetrators. sometimes even after the fact, to delegitimize their opponents or justify their own activities. And so, in other words, really, this violence is caused by other factors, and things such as ideology and religious views are added later as a justification for those actions to make the terrorists' actions look a little more honorable or sympathetic to their audience. Um, when we're examining the personal motivations of terrorist groups, some scholars focus on individual feelings, especially alienation or humiliation, that often drives radicalization. Other scholars take a more rational actor approach, focusing on that cost benefit analysis of why an individual would engage in the high risk behavior of terrorism. And so when those scholars are trying to answer this question, they point out that belonging to a terrorist group can convey material or non-material benefits on a member. Starting with the non-material, group membership can provide a sense of belonging, which is especially appealing to individuals who are sort of found on the edges or fringes of society. And we really shouldn't discount that terrorist organizations do pay their members. So it is a job for many of them. And if you're looking for a good discussion on relative deprivation, as it applies to terrorist recruitment, there's an analysis from the International Crisis Group, which argues that relative deprivation, those economic frustrations with the government, is a major cause of ISIS recruitment from Tunisia. And so while evidence shows that terrorist groups rarely achieve the dramatic change in the existing domestic or international order, which they're claiming, that they work for, they do can have significant political and economic impacts. Terrorists can make governments look incompetent by making them seem sort of unable to provide the security which they promise to their citizens. They also call attention to unresolved issues. Enough terrorist activities can really damage economic, social, and political institutions that they can trigger a government collapse, especially in countries with an already weak state capacity. Terrorist groups can seek to use their violence or really leverage that violence to inspire others to join their cause. They hope to do this by triggering a state over response to their violence. In essence, terrorism might be carried out by a few individuals whose hope is that the state can crack down indiscriminately against the population. If the state does this, then more people are likely to be frustrated by the government. Moderates, those people that are a little more willing to compromise with the government are discredited, and the extremist logic that violence is the only solution to the state's failings, that begins to gain some traction and gain some support. And so terrorist groups can be a form of nascent insurgent or guerrilla movements. For revolutionary leaders like Maximilian, terror was an essential part of revolution. Keep in mind that terrorism of Maximilian was state-run, which is a bit different than modern definitions of terrorism. And so over time, revolutionaries shifted their thinking. Terrorism ceased being a means of governing and instead a strategy of achieving revolution. Terrorists rarely seek limited goals such as political or economic reform, since they see the entire political system as illegitimate. So their belief here is seated in the fact that through their seemingly indiscriminate use of violence, all dominant institutions can be shattered and remade. And just as a side note, in terms of 9/11 and the terrorism that was inflicted on the United States, The response by the Bush administration was one in which it was framed as a us versus them kind of war, and you're either with us or you're against us. And really put it was really a black and white way of looking at it. And so, in essence, the Bush administration kind of had painted that us versus them picture for us. And if you're not with us, i.e., if you're criticizing the government's decisions to bomb Iraq and Afghanistan, then by definition you're against us. And if you're against us, then you must be with the terrorists. And so that certainly is problematic for a citizenry who, in a democracy where you're supposed to be allowed to criticize the government and speak out against government actions. Um, okay, moving on to the religion, sort of factors that transform religion into violence. As religion has reemerged in the public realm, it's been accompanied by fundamentalism. The institutional and ideational factors that can transform religious belief into a motivator for violence include three different aspects: anti modernization, which is the fear of rapid social change that undermines existing social and political connections; second, a belief in the cosmic war that leads to dehumanization of enemies, easier to overcome inhibitions about killing if religious doctrines can be used to explain why opponents are ungodly or subhuman. Third, a utopian or messianic kind of aspect to it. If the end of the world is coming soon, the stakes are way higher, would be the sort of message that the terrorists put out. And so, therefore, purifying the world becomes very urgent. And the combination of these factors can push fundamentalism into extreme forms as it causes members to reinterpret the faith in a way that really divorces it from its mainstream foundations. Many fundamentalists of Muslim, Christian, or other faiths would view the radical aspects of terrorism with horror, seeing them as far removed from their own faith. And in fact, it could be argued that fundamentalists have, more in common with other fundamentalists in different religions than with the members of their own religion. And so, regardless of which religion spawn them, these groups share these three core elements. They radically reinterpret their existing religion, arguing that typical traditions have lost their way. Second, they view the world as a sort of a more of a battle between good and evil. And lastly, they see themselves as defenders of truth and warriors of faith, using that to justify violence against those who they see are enemies. They tend to see their enemies as subhuman, and therefore violence against them is an acceptable activity. All right. It looks like we've kind of covered this here already. The three kind of elements, all religions that have their terrorists. I'll leave you with these last two slides for this lecture, as these are sort of my conclusions to the material that's dealing with political violence. Democracies are significantly less prone to political violence. Controlling for other explanations, they are less likely to experience civil war, terrorism, or revolution. The main reason for this can be found in their functioning political participation, which allows for societal actors, nonviolent outlets for frustrations, grievances, etc., to be handled in a nonviolent manner. And so, in essence, insurgent groups and terrorist groups are less likely to even emerge in democracies. At the same time, the freedoms that exist in a democracy may enable global actors to carry out violence in these societies. ISIS attacks in Europe, like the 2016 Paris attack or the 9/11, the U.S. September 11th attacks, those are good examples of transnational terrorism that has impacted a democracy, i.e., in France and the United States. Okay. And I believe this is my last slide. Yep. When this violence emerges, democracies may face the choice of sacrificing political freedoms to increase their security. So, taking away or encroaching on the Fourth Amendment can be one example. But really striking the balance between freedom and security, that's a major challenge for democracies, particularly for the United States. The three countries that I have on this slide have responded to political violence in their country with policies that limit civil liberties, such as the right to privacy and legal rights. The United States passed what's called the Patriot Act post 9/11, which massively increased the ability of the US government to spy on their population. This surveillance state was expanded and may have actually, in fact, violated the Constitution with this discovery of warrantless wiretapping by the NSA, the National Security Agency. This was a secret program that was leaked to the news by former CIA contractor Edward Snowden. He also had worked a little bit for the NSA. Snowden now is believed to be, I think, in Russia. And so these programs apply to suspected terrorists, a person that does not have to actually be convicted of terrorism in court for his or her civil liberties to be ignored. Their goal has been to improve security. Critics argue that these sorts of policies can undermine individual rights, therefore risking core democratic freedoms. And one quote that I'd like to share with you from Benjamin Franklin is, quote, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety," close quote. So in addition, some of these critics argue that harsher policies, such as the French and UK policies that suspend legal rights, may actually prove counterproductive. They may undermine state legitimacy and isolate vulnerable population, thereby increasing feelings of alienation and fueling more of that fire for recruitment in radical groups. So this concludes our chapter lecture for chapter 11 on political violence.